the urgent need to meet the global energy demands and combat the climate crisis, making solar the energy of choice takes center stage. As solar gains prominence for a sustainable future, addressing integral challenges become paramount. The discussion will illuminate the untapped potential of participatory governance, drawing inspiration from successful cooperative models and emphasizing its pivotal role in ensuring that the solar projects benefit local communities. Now, addressing challenges involves extending finance and technology, implementing technological innovations for things like grid modernization, diversifying manufacturing, and robust financial backing and incentives, especially from the private sector. Earlier in the day, we spoke to a group of leading philanthropies and think tanks on their role as key enablers in the discourse around tripling the renewables agenda. And a common area of discussion was on the role of policies and institutions. This panel aims to explore various dimensions of swiftly moving towards a renewable future, covering regulatory, financial, technological aspects, including challenges, especially around infrastructure and supply chain gaps. Let me now welcome the esteemed leaders for the final discussion of the first day at the ISA Pavilion at COP28 and get their perspective of these enablers on their experiences on making solar the energy of choice. Uh, the panel today has Excellency Nima Ba, the Chief of Cabinet from the Republic of Guinea, Dr. V. Venu, Chief Secretary, Government of Kerala, Mr. Rara Rashmi, former Special Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India, and Distinguished Fellow at TERI, and Mr. Abhas Jha, Practice Manager from the World Bank. Our Director General, Dr. Mathur, would be moderating this session. So, sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sagar. Uh, First of all, let me add my words of welcome to the panelists and to each one of you for being here today afternoon. One of the key areas that this COP is focusing on is the tripling of renewables by 2030. That's not that far. And tripling clearly means that there has to be an acceleration in a number of areas. As Karan mentioned, we discussed financing and technology in the morning. Here we have a group of policymakers from various different organizations. Mr. Venu is the chief secretary of the state of in the Indian state of Kerala, which has been a leader in public acceptance of solar energy. Mr. Abbas Jha has led the World Bank, particularly in the East Asia and South Asia region, in moving ahead on solarization of cities. Ms. Naima Ba from Guinea has been instrumental in using renewables for rural electrification. And Mr. Rashmi from TERI, Mr. Rashmi was also the chief negotiator here at the COP for many, many years. Mr. Rashmi focuses on a number of areas, including policies that could make the renewables and fossil fuels to be cost effective. It is a great pleasure to moderate this discussion. And let me start with Mr. Wayne. Uh, Kerala has seen a huge growth in two areas in particular. One is on solar ferries, boats which help us move from one place to the other, and these are powered by solar and not by diesel. And the second is in the city of Trivandrum, you have greatly enhanced the solarization, the solar rooftops that are there across the city. Would very, very much like to hear from you. What are the kinds of policy drivers that you used in greatly expanding solar across the state? Oh,
Much. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mathur, eminent fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here at this very important discussion. And I would start by, before I get to the responses which our moderator has asked of me, I would just like to make a general point. Even as we in the world, we rush to achieve a lot of targets in renewables in terms of large numbers to be achieved. I think it's also equally significant to bring in as many people and as many participants into the renewables game, and that's equally significant because we're building up constituencies, not merely in the industrial arena, also everywhere. Where the whole discourse about solar and renewables need to be everyone's choice, and it needs to be owned by everybody. So what I would talk about in the next few minutes is our experience in a small part of a big country, India. We form just 1% of the area of the country. We have a lot of advantages and a lot of disadvantages, which I'll come to. But through that, I hope to arrive at the point you raised. I think what stands out in our experience in Kerala when it comes to solar is the fact that there are thousands and thousands of people, citizens and households, who become part of the solar story. And I think that holds several interesting avenues for other contexts in other countries, other regions to think about, contemplate, and probably adapt. That's where I would like to now talk about our capital city, Thiruvananthapuram, which is known as one of the biggest, the most solarized city among small cities in the country, in India. It is not Thiruvananthapuram alone, but I would like to submit to you that there are 36,000 people. There are 36,000 households across the length and breadth of our state who have become prosumers. They produce and they consume. They put the energy from their rooftops onto the grid. They also consume, so a portion of what they do. This is a project called Saura, which we started a few years ago and has found increasing acceptance. I think one of the questions that was asked to me some time back is why has this happened in the state of Kerala? And mind you, if you look at this total number of people who have adapted to solar, it is 50% of the country's number. If you look at the rooftop solar household adaptation, 1% state with 1% of the total area has 50% of the total adapted community. The reason is that the regulator, the utility supplier, the agency, the facilitating agency, they all put their brain heads together and crack this whole thing. So for the consumer, let me speak about my household, right? My mother-in-law is now 84, but when she was 79 years of age or 77, somebody came to her and said, let's put a rooftop on your solar, let's put a solar system on your rooftop. And she said, I know nothing about this. They said, do you have 200,000 rupees to be paid to an agency which will come to you? She said, I might not have it immediately, but I can give it to you in 3 installments. I said, fine, done. And they said, okay, here is a paper you need to sign. And before she knew it, our rooftop had solar, right? And she became one, and she became an advocate for this. She became a champion because with the minimum of fuss, a group of technical guys came in. They brought in the equipment. She didn't have to go make any calls, meet any people, and she was already onto the grid. So I think that is the important thing for bringing in consumers and the little production units that solar is best known for. We need to make things very simple. Okay, that means an aggregation of service providers, technicians, the financing guys. Okay, 40% of this rooftop solar system in our state has a subsidy element. Okay, 40% subsidy element. Now, so that financing has to come from somewhere, and therein probably ISA and the bank and all have probably can play a role. So that's the first point I'd like to make, that the regulator, the distributor, the service provider came together to enable consumer a painless deal, right? Which made
Mhm,
very easy adaptation. The second point you mentioned was about solar ferries,
mhm,
right? And solar ferries brings me to this very interesting point again. Kerala is known for its different kinds of experimentation, right? Bring in solar into everyday aspects. Okay, and I'm sure that the same goes for many parts of the world. But I think one area where it has now become a standing example is the solar powered ferry,
mhm,
right? A public sector utility, belonging to the government, which ran hundreds of boats, decided to, uh, uh, how do I say this, believe in the idea of an entrepreneur, a homegrown, ordinary small entrepreneur, who said that, look, after numerous experiments and failures, I have now created a vessel that can actually be run on solar. And today it's years and tens of thousands of kilometers later, we can very proudly say that
mhm,
here is something that has been homegrown. Okay, runs 80% on solar. I can't say that it's a 100% thing because we are a tropical part of the country where prone to immediate how can I say it? A lot of time when there will be rainfalls, clouds, and all that. Today, 6 years down the line, solar ferries have become passe. People don't even bat an eyelid when you talk about solar ferries or small solar boats, passenger boats, and that's because we adapted technology that is appropriate,
mhm,
done by a local entrepreneur, and probably that holds a lesson, something that a model that others can replicate. We also have uh, we also have another set of solar ferries, and this is not homegrown.
mhm,
This is we have a relationship with KfW as part of a initiative, nationwide initiative called Smart Cities, and part of that, KfW brought in international technology, and they build state-of-the-art ferries today. Okay, these ferries today are part of the Kochi water metro. Kochi is our biggest city, and in Kochi we have already started the Kochi water metro. There today, at the moment, we have about 6 or 8 boats in service, but probably over the next 2 years, we will have about 25 to 30 boats, which will call on different points in the city, offering an alternative to road-based services. And Kochi will then become one city which has a solar-powered airport and a solar-powered water metro. So I'll stop here and take away questions, if any, later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was excellent. I also want to say one more thing. Kerala is the state which got the first airport which works on solar. And I think there's something else that we created the template. Kerala created the template which is now being used across the world. So again, many, many thanks to you and
Thank
to
you.
Kerala.
Thank you.
Abbas, as the World Bank is working on development, it is also simultaneously working on mitigation. So, both in urban areas as well as in agriculture, particularly as far as solar cooling is concerned, these are areas where you have worked very hard and convinced local policymakers to move ahead. What is your learnings and experience in these areas?
So, first of all, thank you, Ajay, for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. To answer your question, I want to kind of build on what Venu said, and I want to go back to his mother in law.
Uh,
So, I think the first point I would raise is financial innovation. So, we need more instruments whereby his mother in law or people like her should not have to even pay that 200,000 rupees
Yeah,
upfront.
right.
yeah.
We need more instruments by which it should be free. And basically, the savings that you get over time, that should pay off your loan. And
Okay.
there are models of that. For example, in New York State in the US, they have what are called energy efficiency bonds, whereby a bond is issued and it's paid off by the savings that the household.
Or the LED program in India.
Exactly. I'm coming to that, in fact. So, and this is where, ISA or institutions like the World Bank can help by experimenting, but also by standardizing, I think. Because if you have, for example, standard contract agreements or standard procurement agreements, that saves the cost for, countries like Guinea, or to learn from India or from, wherever. Sort of that you problem in public policy, as you well know, is that we try to reinvent the wheel every time,
Every time.
whereby, but there's so much learning out there. So that's point number one, I would say, more financial innovation. The second, and I think very, very underutilized instrument, is public procurement. And you mentioned the LED light bulbs, but we don't realize the power of public procurement. And since you mentioned cities and cooling, one of the biggest expenditures of any city across the world is street lighting.
Yeah.
Now, for example, let's say if the city or the national government were to mandate that all street lights will be now solar, that in itself, it opens up a huge market, which allows the private sector to come in if they know that there's a certainty that these cities will procure that. So I think we need, again, ISA and World Bank and ADB and everyone kind of come in to work with governments to, I wouldn't say exploit is not the right word, but to better benefit from public procurement. And the final point I'll mention is technology. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the numbers I had seen is that 1 megawatt of solar requires 3 to 7 acres of land, plus
Something
minus
of that sort.
something. Now, when you talk about cities and rooftop solar, and Kerala is a great example where land is such a huge constraint. So I think now we need to explore what are the other ways, how can technology help us in maybe not requiring so much land, new kinds of material which you can maybe,
Put
paint on the
roof,
wall
yeah.
or the roof.
Walls is, yes.
The roads.
The roads,
Yeah.
exactly. The irrigation canals now is becoming commonplace. And again, these are areas where institutions like ours can help share knowledge. If something has worked in Guinea or in Trinidad and Tobago or wherever, we can learn from that and benefit from that. So let me stop there. And
Abbas, thank you very much. I think the point that you raised about constantly moving the technological frontier is an important point, because we are, for example, right here, later in the week, we will be having at least two discussions on floating solar, or uh, I think one of them is called floatonomics, if I'm not wrong. But the point is that as you run out of space, we do need to see how we can use, for example, water bodies
exactly.
for solar to be placed on top of that. This, I think, needs both experimentation, and what works can certainly be transferred to other countries.
Exactly.
Madam, can I move to you and request you to share with us the rural electrification program that Guinea has launched? So you can talk of anything you want.
Merci, monsieur le modérateur. Yeah, you get that. Okay. Merci, monsieur le modérateur.
Here you are. This is. Look, oh, yeah, I'm waiting for something.
Voilà, tout le monde a la traduction. Et je disais donc que je remercie le modérateur et je remercie Lisa de nous inviter à ce panel et de nous donner l'opportunité d'exprimer ici nos besoins et d'échanger avec les pays qui ont de l'expérience dans le domaine, comment développer les énergies renouvelables, surtout en milieu rural. Je remarque ici autour de ce panel que je suis la seule de la région Afrique. Je me sens honorée de partager l'expérience de mon pays. Et je commencerai par parler un peu des objectifs à atteindre en matière de politique énergétique depuis la COP 21 par la Guinée. Vous savez que la Guinée a un potentiel hydroélectrique très élevé, plus de 6300 mégawatts de potentiel qui sont là, avec seulement 14% du potentiel qui est utilisé à ce jour. Une irradiation solaire de 4,8 joules par mètre carré par jour. et de la biomasse aussi qu'on pourrait développer. Mais cela dit, actuellement, 75% de l'électricité voilà, produite en Guinée vient de l'hydroélectrique. Et avec ce qui se présente au niveau des changements climatiques, nous sommes confrontés, surtout les 2 dernières années, à l'assèchement de certains cours d'eau, les plus grands fleuves qui d'ailleurs régulent tout le flux dans l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Vous savez que la Guinée est la source des plus grands fleuves de la sous-région de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Et aujourd'hui, nous sommes confrontés à l'assèchement de ces cours d'eau-là. Donc, la nécessité d'avoir une production hybride avec le solaire est plus que nécessaire. Même avec les barrages électriques, le peu d'électricité qui est produite au niveau des centres urbains. Donc, nécessité également d'avoir du solaire si on veut gérer la transition énergétique en même temps en milieu rural. Pour cela, la Guinée a opté donc sur des politiques de développement des énergies renouvelables en créant au niveau des universités des centres de formation. Une grande université publique développe déjà des filières de formation en photovoltaïque. Une autre université privée fait la même chose. Au niveau du public, nous n'avons pas encore des projets publics dans le solaire. Mais par contre, au niveau des privés, avec le soutien de certains partenaires, nous avons développé les zones rurales, pas beaucoup. Je ne sais pas si c'est projeté, voilà. Quelques projets solaires en Guinée qui ont commencé à faire leurs preuves. Il y a un projet qui est déjà terminé et un second qui est en train d'être développé à l'image du premier. Et dans la deuxième grande ville qui est appelée Cancan, on va développer 2 autres projets avec Clean Power et une autre société qui s'appelle Shift Ivoire. Donc, vous verrez que c'est vraiment, on est au début, tout à fait au début, où nous avons besoin d'appui technique, de transfert de technologie, de financement pour pouvoir aller de l'avant. C'est l'occasion de remercier Lisa pour le soutien porté dans ce cadre, parce que nous avons quelques programmes ici avec Lisa sur le solaire des universités, cette université en Guinée. Le financement est déjà acquis à travers Exim Bank. Nous sommes en train de travailler là-dessus. Il y a aussi des mini-centrales solaires qui vont être installées. Les sites de ces mini-centrales ont été identifiés et puis un DAO est en train d'être préparé pour le recrutement d'un cabinet d'études pour lancer les études. Il y a un autre programme sur les toitures solaires. Ils ont donné l'expérience des toitures solaires tout à l'heure, ce qui est très intéressant pour nous. Donc là aussi, l'identification des sites est en cours. Il y a un autre programme de 100 MW de solaire qui sera une plateforme flottante de 70 MW et au niveau du barrage de Garafiri, c'est l'un des barrages hydroélectriques sur le grand fleuve du Concouré et 30 MW sur le sol. Je crois qu'il y a une mission qui se prépare à aller en Guinée probablement au mois de janvier pour travailler sur ce projet. Donc, c'est l'occasion pour nous de vraiment remercier Lisa pour cet appui et nous aimerions avoir plus, surtout dans le transfert de technologie. Comme on a installé les filières dans les universités, on a besoin de pratique. Les étudiants qui sortent ont besoin de pratique. Ils ont besoin d'échanger d'expériences avec les pays qui sont très avancés là-dessus. Je crois qu'essentiellement, c'est ça que nous pouvons dire sur la Guinée actuellement. Nous sommes vraiment à nos débuts. Nous avons besoin de la banque, nous avons besoin des pays qui ont déjà développé. Nous avons surtout besoin de l'appui de l'ISA pour avancer. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, madam. We look forward to continuing to work with you and to see how solarization can expand. Which leads me to my question to Mr. Rashmi. We have seen successful examples across the world. We have seen that Many of these are even cost effective when compared to fossil fuel, especially if the fossil fuel is imported. Yet, we have not been able to see a large scale development in many parts of the world. How could we ensure that we look at um, innovative business models that can help that can help deploy at a large scale what has worked earlier at a small scale?
Thank you, Dr. Mark. Uh, Thank you very much. In fact, the story of renewables in India is a remarkable one, and you have been the author of the and a great participant in this entire process. So, what has led to the success in India is the fact to what Avas was just mentioning, the public procurement. Mhm. It's one of the tools which the government had employed very consciously and aggressively to bring down the cost of deployment of solar technology in the production of electricity. And that has indeed happened. The cost of variable cost of solar production in India has fallen remarkably. It's today lower than that of the coal fired electricity. Uh, so this is a great success. But obviously, every success also has its other sides. Challenges are there. So while we try to ramp up the renewable energy uh, as one possible source of electricity, we also need to look at the entire energy system. Renewable energy, after all, is one component of the total energy system and the entire sources of all the sources of electricity that we have. So growth in the energy demand and the growth in renewables has to match, number one, and it has to match and proceed apace in a manner that it feeds into the grid. Because the grid is the one which supplies the energy to all components of economic sectors. So the to be able to supply electricity in a reliable and stable fashion, renewable energy has to play that role of the being the at the harbinger of technological innovation. So that is something which we need to address. This is the first challenge which we have in scaling up renewable energy in the entire energy system. We need to solve this technological problem of being intermittent, and we have to somehow store this energy to be able to supply it at the time when we need it. Now, how do we do that? That's the second question. Obviously, finance is uh, a required instrument. So, in the initial period when public procurement policies could help scale up the renewable energy, it really happened. And if I give you the numbers, about 12 years ago, or maybe 14 years ago, it was just about 1,000 megawatts. Today, it's now 170,000 megawatts in India. So it's a remarkable jump in terms of production. You cannot use public procurement policies beyond a point. You have to look at other financial solutions. For example, with the variable cost of renewable energy having fallen, the the fresh private investments in coal-fired plants has stopped, and renewable energy investments in the renewable energy has started picking up pace. But that pace is still smaller than what is actually required. Now, Prime Minister of India has set a target of 500 gigawatts by 2030, and we are at 170 today. So which means we have to fill up another 230 gigawatts of energy from cleaner sources or renewable sources in the next 8 years. So the scale at which you have to do this is tremendous. It's stupendous. So what kind of investments are required? I think you were mentioning about the total cost, the cost per megawatt cost of renewable energy. If you look at that, we are investing at a scale of which can generate only about 20 gigawatts per year. But we have to do much more than that. So we need a phenomenal amount of money, resources, both domestic and international, In addition to this technological innovation, as far as the source of intermittent, resolving the intermittent nature of the renewable energy is concerned. So the last point which I would mention in this, I think Venu was and both Habas were pointing to this. This part of the solution perhaps lies in decentralizing the renewable energy system and transferring the consumption to the generation point. So solar rooftops are a good example of that. Agricultural solar pumps are another good program in India. But I think we need to replicate this at a larger scale, and we need good financial instruments, good business models to be able to do this. And I'm sure there are any number of institutions and stakeholders which can come up this. Guinea is a good example of where the government itself is trying to do this. So we need to look at this third possible pillar of scaling above the renewable energy into the system. I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think your emphasis on public procurement and on using the uh, the financing, if I may say so, as tools for upgradation ring a lot of bells. Uh, that leads me to the question, Venu. Kerala is an extremely densely populated state, and therefore there will be limits to how much land is available for solar. How on earth will you do more?
Good question, and good question, and I'll try to paraphrase that.
Okay,
If not on earth, and what to do?
okay,
So
yeah,
it's already been brought up here that we will have to look at water, the plants which are floating.
yeah.
So in Kerala, we have taken certain initiatives. Kerala is, for most of the people here who may not know my state, it is about 27% of the entire area is covered by water. It's inland water bodies, reservoirs. Madam, you were talking about dams. So we have over 61 dams, small, tiny, big. Total area which we have uh, uh, as water bodies within the landmass of Kerala is about 1,218 square kilometers.
Mhm.
Okay. Might not be significant if it looks at a larger area,
But
but when it comes to a state like Kerala, it is a very significant part of our of our system. Now we have set certain very ambitious targets.
Mhm.
We hope to generate 5,000 megawatts uh, by means of deployment of floating solar plants and by active participation and involvement of the private sector investments into these areas by long-term leases and all that. We have already started our first phase of about 500 megawatts is already online.
okay,
I think the technology needs to develop further. I think we are still very nascent in that. Number one, but I think more importantly, we need the financing connections to develop further. Just as we said that the small entrepreneur, the small householder, the methodology to get on board has become very easy. I think these floating solar plants, which could be the solution in many areas. Similar to Kerala in Africa, in Southeast Asia, I'm sure. These areas, the constraint will now be financing.
Mhm.
So I think people like Abbas and the ISA uh, would need to advise us uh, as to how we can innovate in terms of creating new instruments which can bring in the private investment that we really need in the sector.
Thank you. Abbas, Venu has set a challenge for you. How on earth does the World Bank, which lends to sovereign governments, enable? I mean, this is a little bit technical, but how do you enable lending to the government in a framework that looks for development by the private sector?
So that's a very, very good question. And that's one that we are struggling with right now. And you might have seen in the news that we have a new president.
Right.
And the new president has come from the private sector. So he has very well developed ideas on how we should go about this. But let me say this. I was in a meeting recently with a former Secretary of Department of Economic Affairs, who shall remain unnamed. And he said that the World Bank needs to be a little humble, that my Deputy Secretary budget borrows more in a week than the World Bank lends to India in a year. And that kind of underlines the challenge, but it also underlines the opportunity, which I think you are hinting at, which is that how do you use scarce money from development institutions or even scarce government money to crowd in private sector?
Right.
That is, I think, the challenge of today's time. And I'll give you one startling statistic about this. A solar project, if you do it in Europe, the cost of capital is about 2 to 3%. If you do exactly the same project in Africa, the cost of capital is 19%. And if you are telling me that the risk is, the 16%,
it's that much more.
That just does not make any sense. Right. So then that means that the private sector is getting or mispricing the risk. And that is where I think we need to step in. Right. Governments need to step in. World Bank needs to step in. All multilateral, bilaterals need to step in to kind of align that risk more with reality. And thereby, so we are talking about things like partial risk guarantees. That could be one alternative. Others, like we always default to debt. Why can't we talk about equity, for example? Why can't the World Bank take an equity position in some of this, or ADB? And I must hasten to clarify that I'm speaking only on my behalf. I'm not trying to, commit the World Bank on any of these. But these are ideas that we need to explore because we are in a new world whereby our capital is not even a drop in the ocean.
So I completely accept the fact that your capital is not even a drop in the ocean, and therefore guarantees provide a far more leverage.
Yeah.
This much money as guarantees will have 10 to 20 times
Exactly
the impact of pulling in private sector capital. So, Madam had earlier said that we need financing. I'm not putting it to you, but or to the World Bank, but if there were, I'm asking you, Madam, if there were public sector, if there were, for example, World Bank or African Development Bank guarantees, would that be able to pull in more private sector money in for the kinds of projects that you're talking about?
Merci. Je pense que oui, parce que, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, les projets qui sont actuellement développés ont été développés par des partenaires privés. Donc, peut-être qu'avec l'appui de la banque, ils seront beaucoup plus tentés d'aller de l'avant et ça va accroître les emprunts. Quand on a un partenaire comme la banque ou la BAD ou les autres partenaires classiques qui mettent déjà de l'argent, tout de suite, ça incite les autres à venir là-dedans. Et peut-être que ça permettra à notre secteur privé aussi, qui n'est pas encore très impliqué dans le développement des énergies renouvelables, de s'impliquer aussi. Ça leur permettrait de s'impliquer. Mais pour le moment, ils ne sont pas très impliqués parce qu'ils ne voient pas encore l'intérêt ou pas l'impact, mais l'intérêt de ce qu'ils peuvent gagner par derrière. Mais si des partenaires classiques comme la banque font le point de départ, c'est une source d'incitation pour les autres.
So I'm going to ask you yet another question.
Okay.
Is the Minister of Finance amenable to this?
I didn't get your
The
question.
Minister of Finance,
Mm.
would he be willing to, would he be, would he be, would he find it attractive? Would the Minister of Finance
Mhm.
find this attractive? Would he be helpful to the Ministry of Energy?
Certainement, certainement, certainement. Parce que Parfois, nous sommes confrontés à des difficultés de financement parce qu'on ne voit pas par derrière si je dirais, les gros prêteurs classiques comme la Banque mondiale par derrière, la BAD, voilà. Quand on ne les voit pas derrière, on n'est pas très convaincu de la nécessité de mettre de l'argent. Mais si la banque, à travers, j'ai vu qu'ils sont enclins à accompagner le secteur privé à travers des mécanismes qu'ils sont en train de mettre en place, d'accompagner la Guinée pour ce secteur particulier, je pense que c'est une mesure incitative et que le ministère des Finances serait prêt à accompagner. Une part du budget national pourrait accompagner.
Thank you very much. Rashmi-san, you had brought up the issue of public procurement. One of the problems that we face is that in many countries, and this is countries outside India, the volumes are not large enough to help this to happen. Would harmonization of standards across several countries help in reducing the cost? Even the procurement will have to be done by each country itself, but a harmonization of standards, would that help?
Well, I'm not the best person to answer
Okay.
that. But suppose to some extent it will help because after all, procurement is a financial operation and competitiveness, trade, pricing, these have a role to play. To a certain extent, I am sure the standardization would bring down the prices or at least ensure some kind of predictability about the prices and bring down the overall cost of operations and bring down the transaction cost. Maybe ISA can play a role.
Yes.
Because we are talking of alliances, global
Right.
alliances, regional alliances. So I think time has come where the countries need to cooperate, come together, and help uh, 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 a coalition of this nature do the procurement on their behalf, which would bring down and mobilize the required resources and use the harmonized standards to bring down the cost for everyone.
I come back to ISA's experience. We tried to do procurement for pumps, solar pumps. So we did standards and we got the requirements from several countries and did a procurement. The price that we found was approximately 42% less than the ruling cost.
Mm.
But the number of countries who bought on the basis of that was zero, because every country has its own procurement procedures. And one of the things that we have learned is that it is not possible to use multiple country procurement. And that is why my question was, would the standards harmonization alone, or I don't know whether even the price discovery mechanism itself may be useful, because after that, what did happen was that the person who was the winner of the solar pumps bid, he entered into contracts with several countries at prices which were which were lower. The discount price begins with this price.
Price. Yeah.
Competition. So that helped, but ISA directly didn't help.
So my response to that would be, Dr. Mathur, that you require two more things in addition to a public procurement policy to be able to, and harmonization of standards. You need, number one, also a policy commitment to use solar as a primary tool of driving up the, towards cleaner energy sources.
Right.
So that has to be built into the policy of the country concerned. And there are different ways of doing it. It could be a part of the NDC, it could be part of some other policy declaration. And the second is financing. So again, harmonization of standards alone does not help unless you mobilize or provide the required finances to be able to support that procurement. And there are countries which actually run short of resources on that count. So for them, it may not be the obvious priority because there are 17 developmental goals for which they have to mobilize resources. So an organization or an alliance of this kind needs to do both, to canvass for a policy commitment, and number one, to help them in procuring the required resources, which would then support this kind of procurement
So
exercise.
what, for example, can be done is that the Alliance and the World Bank get, or the Asian Development Bank, or the African Development Bank, or the Inter-American Development Bank get into bed, and the banks provide loans to the countries who participate in this tender, and then following this can either do their own tenders or can use these results if it meets their procurement needs. Yes, others.
So can I add to this and maybe a slightly out of the box idea for the ISA, which is that there are two big trends that we need to be cognizant of today. One is that the name of the game is global value chains.
Okay.
It's not about producing everything yourself, but embedding yourself in these value chains, which cross borders. That's number one. But also now after COVID, we are talking about resiliency and friend shoring and China plus one in the whole supply chain. So if you let's take the case of say Africa. Can we think of a kind of a hub and spoke model where one country could be the anchor, but there are other countries that are also putting inputs into the solar panels, and solar panel requires a lot of things.
Yeah.
So you build a kind of a regional hub whereby each country has a stake in it, and then you do procurement that is regional. Because right now, what your problem is that, let's say, take South Asia. Why would Nepal want to buy Indian solar? They would want the jobs in Nepal or Bangladesh or wherever. But if you give them a stake in the game, whereby some of the components are being made in Nepal, some are being made in Bangladesh, some are being made in, then perhaps your regional procurement could succeed. So that's an idea.
This is a great idea, actually. I think as the Solar Alliance, we'll certainly work towards it. We had recently carried out a study on manufacturing. And what we found was that solar cells to solar modules make sense no matter where in the world you are talking about, as long as demand is large.
Exactly.
But you're right. One country may manufacture inverters, another country may do the glass, a third country may do the backing. Yes, so there is a possibility of creating regional interest or regional buy-in to such programs. We have some time. We have, okay. So let me open it up to questions from the audience, and we will ask please identify yourself and preferably the person to whom the question is meant. Sir.
Merci, monsieur le modérateur. Moi, je suis Mambi Doumbouya. Je suis directeur national de l'énergie de la Guinée. J'ai bien écouté et je remercie Isa d'avoir organisé ce panel qui est très enrichissant. J'ai des questions pour monsieur le chef de gouvernement de Kerala et monsieur Abbas aussi, de la Banque mondiale. Et pour monsieur le chef de gouvernement de Kerala, je voulais savoir, aujourd'hui, comme il a dit, il y a un peu de ressemblance entre chez lui et notre pays en matière de l'hydro et en matière de solaire. Mais nous, le solaire, on n'a qu'un début. Et quels sont les pourcentages euh, de consommation énergétique par rapport au solaire et de l'hydro? Le solaire qui est installé à Kerala, est-ce que c'est la plupart, c'est des solaires flottantes ou la toiture solaire? Pour M. Abbas, il vient de dire que le directeur général de la Banque mondiale actuelle vient du secteur privé. C'est ça que nous souhaitons pour que il nous donne des mécanismes financiers simples qui peuvent attirer des investisseurs privés venir s'adresser à la Banque mondiale pour trouver des financements fonds.
Okay. Can somebody look at the mic? But meanwhile, can I ask Venu and Abha to respond?
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So I will try to uh, outline the energy position in Kerala. I mentioned that we have a very strong hydroelectric element in our overall power generation. So close to about 45% of the total power requirement of the state, Kerala, is met from the hydroelectric power generated from within the state. Solar power is currently only at about 5%, and the rest is close to 50% or about 55%. Over 50%, let us say, comes from the thermal power which we purchase from other states. This is the reason why moving to solar and trying to exploit as much of the available potential as we can is so important for the future of the state. Because as you can imagine, purchasing thermal power itself is a very costly investment for us year by year, but also that we would like to transition into using more renewable power, uh, both from the financial point of view, but also looking at the future. Kerala, in the other session that I will be attending along with Abbas, we will talk about how Kerala is a net sink, when it comes to carbon. And so we have certain very ambitious objectives and ideas in terms of becoming the carbon sink and adopting low carbon pathways. So this fits into that overall objective. Now coming to solar in our water bodies, currently our production is about 150 megawatts. We have two fairly big floating solar plants. We have been supported by the World Bank as part of our resilience program. We are doing a very extensive technical survey of all the other water bodies in order to prepare the ground for offering these areas, these water bodies, for investment by private entrepreneurs. So that's where we are.
Thank you. Abbas?
So if I understood your question correctly, it was about the private sector and how the World Bank can help facilitate that. So my answer is, first of all, I have to clarify that I don't work on Africa. I work on South Asia. But I do know that in general, the World Bank, one of the pillars of our work is to enable private sector. If we are talking about eliminating, say, extreme poverty in the entire world, that growth will come from the private sector. So we do have to do everything we can to facilitate that. Now, in the context of solar or generally in terms of energy, there's a lot that countries can do to clean up and put their own house in order. I mean, one example is fossil fuel subsidies. The IMF came out with a report recently. I don't remember the exact number, but it's something to the order of $3 to $4 trillion. Uh, and I'm not sure about Guinea, but I'm sure that Guinea is also like most of our countries, whereby there's still a huge amount of fossil fuel subsidies. So that is a low-hanging fruit. If you just take that and put that in renewable energy, that is much more than any finance that the World Bank can provide. So that is just one idea.
Thank you. Thank
Can I,
you very
can I
much.
make a
Yes.
comment,
Yes.
please? Ok, je suis panéliste, mais je voudrais. Le représentant de la banque a dit quelque chose tout à l'heure qui est très intéressant pour nous. Quand il a vu le développement du solaire sous une forme sous-régionale, la production des énergies. Actuellement, l'interconnexion que nous faisons en Afrique de l'Ouest avec les pays de l'OMVG, Organisation mise en valeur des fleuves Gambie, c'est un grand fleuve, et l'autre, CLSG, les 4 pays du Sud, etc., c'est de l'interconnexion sur la base hydroélectrique. Et les fleuves partent de chez nous et redistribuent l'électricité comme ça. Je crois que ce serait une bonne idée aussi pour le solaire, parce que les pays sont tellement petits que vouloir développer des systèmes solaires pour chacun des pays compliquerait la tâche. Je ne sais pas si vous êtes avancé sur l'initiative ou si c'est à ses débuts. Nous, de notre côté, nous encourageons vraiment cette initiative-là. Merci.
So I think that's a very, very important question that you raised. And I can talk about the South Asia experience. So about 2 years ago, and Ajay can correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 years ago, the government of India passed a very important regulation whereby they allowed third party countries to wheel power through India to another country. So, for example, Bhutan can sell power to Bangladesh by using India's grid. That was, I think, 2 years ago that they passed the regulation. And in my mind, this regional power trading is one of the most good public policy measures that a country can take. Because as you said, many countries are small, you don't get the economies of scale. But if you start then trading across a larger group of countries, that enables you to tap into this power of the economies of scale. Um, so, but for that, what you need is good regulations, good guidelines. The grids need to be able to interconnect. So there's a public policy regulation aspect, but there's also an infrastructure aspect because you need to build the infrastructure for the interconnections. But I would say that South Asia, this is one of the big successes I think we have had in enabling this power trading, at least to the eastern side. So India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan.
I will also add here, Madam, as the International Solar Alliance, we carried out a training for about 50, 60 engineers from the West African Power Pool, of which Guinea is a
Yeah.
part. And they were in 3 batches of 20 people each on the issue of grid stability when you add increasing amounts of variable renewable energy. And these engineers came to India. There were obviously lectures, but more importantly, they visited the places where this grid management occurs. So, for example, in the southern region, there is a grid manage. We have 5 grid management centers. One of them is in the southern region, and there, you see solar coming up in the morning. So what goes off? You see solar decreasing in the evening. So what comes on? You see wind coming in suddenly. What goes off? So in real time, how do you do the management? That is something that we are deeply involved in and will continue to be involved, not only with the West African Power Pool, but starting from here with the East African Power Pool as well. So let me thank all of you for this extremely interesting discussion. I want to thank each of our panelists on behalf of each one of you for absolutely stunning presentations of what is happening in the countries. I want to thank you and panelists for this wonderful afternoon. Thank you very, very much.
Recording stop.